Hello, all. This is Dr. David Hall with Church Psychology. And let me ask you a question. Do you assume that as a Christian, you are supposed to be nice? Because if that's the case, I have some challenges for you. I do believe that we are all called to live in kindness. What is the difference between being nice and being kind? If you're interested in unpacking that with Matt and I, hope you'll stay tuned for today's episode of our podcast. Now let's hit that intro music.
Welcome to Church Psychology, a podcast of the Negev Institute. We are mental health professionals looking at the intersections of social and behavioral science in the Christian life. Please connect with our free resources in our open community library at churchpsychology.org. We would be grateful if you would follow, like, or subscribe to Church Psychology wherever you are finding us, and also leave us a review. As we start, if we are to love the Lord our God with all of our mind, it makes sense to work on our headspace. So let's get to work. Well, welcome everybody to the Church Psychology Podcast. My name is Matt Schuneman. I'm here again with Dr. David Hall. Hey, David.
Hey, Matt.
Hey, it's good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
For those watching on YouTube, if you do watch on YouTube, David's got his Harry Potter glasses on today.
It is. It feels a little fraudulent because
Fraudulent.
It does because they're not prescription glasses. I will say it's blue light.
Oh, yes.
But I find if I've had a day where I'm on the screen a lot, this helps me avoid headaches. And
well, at least they have lenses and they don't you can push through.
Yeah. It's not
it's
just
not
show.
A fashion trend that you're doing.
Yeah, it is functional, just not in the ways that people assume. But
yeah. You look great in them.
Oh, thank you.
And so
it makes me look smarter, hopefully.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And so, well, today, David, let's talk about some things. What do you say?
Okay.
Yeah.
I have an idea.
Okay. Tell me your idea. I wonder if it matches mine.
So I'll give context of why I have this idea.
Yes, please.
I was in my church, we will do periodically silent retreats. We go to this retreat center up in the mountains and fortunately live pretty close to the mountains. And so it's not about an hour drive of a place a bit more remote that it's a retreat center. And we'll do these silent retreats where it's pretty minimal in the sense of what we're doing is really designed for prayer and some selective reading. We don't have our phones available to us, no computers. You have a Bible, usually a journal notebook, and some devotional reading idea, but it's a really kind of great time and space to just stop and slow down. And I always find them to be very positive. But we will, the person that leads these retreats, it's volunteer clergy at my church. He's retired, but he will kind of set up the event. And we do have a church service at night where he'll deliver a short homily. We'll take communion and he's speaking. The rest of us don't, but he's speaking.
Yeah.
And there was one time that he gave a homily where he was talking about all these people being too focused on kindness. And it was in a kind of sense of the world is too focused on this. And I remember thinking at the time of it's interesting that you choose this topic on a silent retreat because I can't quibble with you after it. I did later.
Rebuttal you.
I rebutted you, but I had a sense of what he was getting at. I go, you need to be very careful when you're disclaiming one of the stated fruits of the Spirit.
Right. Right. Yes.
But it did get me started thinking of something, and that's the initial story of the context for the conversation today. Because as I thought through what he was getting at, I'm like, okay, how I would say differently, what I think he was trying to get at is a lot of people elevate the importance of being nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what I proposed to Matt that we could talk about is what is unpacking the difference between being nice and being kind, or niceness versus kindness.
Yeah.
So that is what I would suggest for today. Hopefully it lines up with what Matt is.
No, that's good. When I think about nice, we, like we've talked about in this podcast, is that we're from the Knoxville, Tennessee area. That's where our offices are. And I think we both grew up in the East Tennessee area.
Mhm.
I know you've kind of been to different cities since, but
Mhm.
we've grown up with the kind of Southern cultural expectations of niceties and niceness, and so some of that's partly cultural in the sense of, I mean, there's a lot of aspects we could go in this conversation, but I think that one being that where we are, there's that Southern niceties that you get a lot. We have a colleague and friend that uh, did not grow up in this area, grew up in the Northeast in the New York area. And when you're up in New York, it's a way different in the cultural context of like how we interact versus, so very direct up there, and
Mhm.
sometimes not so nice. Um,
No,
and here down very passive. And sometimes again, it's kind of all like fluffy talk right now, but like the bless your heart is a common knowledge down here. It doesn't always mean a good blessing.
that's not a good thing. Yeah, if
It's
you're
not
not from the South,
it's
someone
it's,
says, "Bless
"Oh,
your
that
heart."
guy, yeah, you're an idiot." That's what he's
Yeah,
saying.
it's not a good thing
Yeah,
to
yeah,
have invoked. But
yeah,
taking out of yours and my specific regional context, Matt,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and talking about the church, I think oftentimes there has been this elevation to my pastor friend of mine, because I do think he was getting at something that was important. There
Yeah,
has been this elevation of niceties, kind of as that becomes the highest level of Christian virtue. And the challenge
mm,
that can naturally come out of that is we become people that don't really stand up for very much.
mm,
We're not willing to challenge other people. If we see other people doing wrong, to challenge them it's not really nice to confront. Being confrontational
yeah,
is not nice. Being
and
disagreeable is not nice. And
right,
it's often where for some what a lot of us see as very kind of core theological things that a lot of uh, different sorts of churches or denominations have gotten looser on. Oftentimes, it's been in the desire to be nice. Well, we
yeah,
don't want to like this person sees this differently, and
yeah.
we'll
Well, and
see.
I would even add, and maybe you'll speak to this when we talk about some of the language behind this, but to add a different word other than just nice is polite.
Yeah,
Um, the kind of manners and the rules kind of set, whether in your family system, in your culture, in your church, of what is being polite versus what's not being polite, what's being, having good manners versus not. Those things I think bleed into this concept of niceties.
mhm. And they've been elevated in ways that, from a mental health perspective, are not true,
Yeah.
and I would say from a biblical perspective, represent falsehoods.
Yeah.
And we can speak to shift into the practical bit of the work that Matt and I do as mental health providers. Politeness and niceness in that way
Mm.
causes a lot of issues in families, we
Yeah.
see, because it's avoidance. It's often a way that either people can manipulate.
Yeah.
We'll often work with systems or with families that it's clear they're not necessarily being very authentic with each other. That was a recent episode Matt and I did. We're talking about authenticity and how to cultivate that, the importance of that. And
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
the name of being nice, oftentimes we will cultivate a very deep inauthenticity.
Mhm. Yeah.
And
And this is where you get this concept, and whether it's been claimed this, but in the church culture of a feeling of kind of fake
mm,
fakeness, or fake Christians, or they're putting on a mask. You never really know what people are really thinking. They say all these nice things to you, but you feel like there's still this boundary, this barrier between us. And I think we discussed that in that episode, but I think that this high moral value of niceties as kind of the one of the top things has produced a lot of quote unquote fake people.
yeah, it's very shallow.
Yeah.
It's very and so if the the pastor in question. If he had used that word, I would not have had objections. But he didn't use that word. He used the word kindness. And here's the difficulty with that. That is invoked throughout Scripture as a virtuous posture, a very core virtuous posture. It's listed often in 1 Corinthians in describing love and Christian love, agape love. It's one of the main features of it. In Galatians 5:22, it talking about the fruit of the Spirit. And it was very interesting. This was something that in one of our earlier podcast episodes that you had mentioned, Matt, that the idea in talking about the fruit of the Spirit, that is not being plural, that the fruit of the Spirit is a holistic thing. So kindness being a whole part, that you cannot be manifesting the fruit of the Spirit in that interpretation without
kindness.
Without kindness, without the whole. So similar to a recent episode we did on talk about anxiety, was interested in getting in what are the root words to some of this. And also, again, my apologies of not being a Greek scholar. But so the word that gets translated into New Testament Greek as kindness, or its different variations, Christotes is what I've got for it. Christotes. This is out of Strong's. Its translation of what I'm getting is goodness, kindness, but in even delving into, okay, what does kindness mean? One note I found that was really interesting was talking about this idea of moral goodness and integrity. The sense of this is something good at its core.
Right.
I'll often talk about moral logic. It's the way that we organize or prioritize or rank the importance of things in our lives. It's how do we order things. And in that sense, it allows for there to be kindness. Is all kindness nice is a question. And I would say absolutely not. Because there's so many different examples of that you could say, like, is this person or is this action representing goodness, moral goodness and integrity? Might that involve confrontation? Might that involve rebuke? And I say this all the time to clients, because I will have clients sometimes push back on me in some of the things I say to them in the context of therapy. And they'll say, that's not very nice. And I will say to them, it's not my job to be nice. It's my job to care for you. And in this sense too, I've even said it's my job to be kind, but it would be very unkind to point this out. For example, my, I'll be out in social situations and, sometimes my wife will say like, hey, you need a mint. Now, I don't necessarily take that as very nice that she's telling me that my breath is bad. And I will sometimes get a little prickly about that at first. But you know what? That is ultimately a kind act. She's not necessarily doing it for her own benefit. It's oftentimes we're in other social situations. And I want to know that. Oftentimes when, a good friend is somebody that will be honest with you in the spirit of kindness, even if it's not nice.
Right. And I think that differentiation is helpful to hear. I know, though, that there are some out there like me that hear that and say, like, yeah, that's still really tough. And part of this goes to elements of, again, back to what kind of system were you raised in? What were the morality of your church or your family that kind of instilled in you what is nice versus kind? Or did they maybe not even had that differentiation? So for some to step into this or even consider, okay, kind can be harsh at time, or what's a good word? Difficult at times. It could be conflict producing at times. Is probably really hard to think about. And you think about personality types too. I am one, David, you and I have been friends for a little while. I think that you're a little better at conflict than I am. You step into it easier. I have worked on it for years, and maybe we talk about conflict. I just did one on our church's podcast, and it was really, really helpful. But I think conflict is such an interesting topic of where this intersects niceties and kindness.
Mhm.
Because nice would say that I am not allowed to step into conflict. If I hurt this other person in any way or cause them any discomfort, I'm not being nice.
Mhm.
Yet
And
we
that and
know, yeah, and we know in therapy and we know in mental health and even Christian belief that at times we do have to rebuke, we do have to challenge, we do have to speak what's going on in ourselves. If to be authentic and integrous is to, in a sense, say, here's what's going on inside of me right now. And that may not be easy for you to hear.
it is, to your point about, to do these things isn't nice. And when we have equated niceness with godliness or with true goodness,
Yeah.
then it's really easy to see that danger. It's funny you talk about you perceive me as being more comfortable in conflict, and I am, though it is interesting.
It
Like
is a perception. I don't know
it
if you're
is.
actually
I
comfortable with
don't.
it.
I part of it is I was raised in an environment that saw value in conflict,
Mm.
and it's funny. I don't think it's as natural in my personality style. I don't particularly enjoy a lot of conflict, but I do think, and this is where I think the culture we set within our families and within our churches about the differentiation between niceness and kindness matters.
Right.
Because I feel if my temperament was formed in a different environment, I think I probably have a lot harder time with conflict.
Yeah.
But I was given a lot of overt messaging and examples of it being lived out. But I was told overtly that being clear and being direct and not skirting difficult things
Yes.
is a
Yeah.
good way to live. And I would see the fruit of that. I would see my family have hard conversations
Hmm.
and it be hard, but things would reach resolution. Church Psychology is a production of the Negev Institute, a research, resource, and teaching initiative that aims to provide Christian communities with practical education and consulting to faithfully speak to our needs in mental health, relational science, and human habit and behavior. A great way to support Negev is to start a free membership in our open community library at churchpsychology.org, and then stay connected with our email newsletter to hear about new classes, publications, live forums, and in-person events. Again, you can find all that at churchpsychology.org.
What's that phrase? Clarity is kindness.
Yes.
And that, to be clear, though, at times is not always comfortable.
Yeah.
And I feel that that is a helpful way. Even okay. So if there are any business leaders listening, I've been listening. I was listening to a Simon Sinek talk, and they were talking about clarity and the importance of it within the structure of an organization, and that the retainment of their staff and the kind of focused mission that they would have as the CEO or as the leader really depended on how clear of a message or of a mission are they setting. Are they sticking to the clarity of what they have? Um, but I've known and been in situations that at times it's difficult for leaders to be clear, not because they don't have an idea of what they want to do, but their clarity could alienate or remove people from participation in it. Does that
Mm.
make sense?
It does. And the same way that I would say niceness isn't kindness in and of itself, sometimes it may represent it.
Yeah.
That clarity, it's a qualified sort of thing, and but it does involve, I guess, the willingness to step into true kindness involves risk is, I guess,
Hmm.
one of the things I'm hearing, and because
Yeah.
you risk a rupture and may risk, but what I learned in being raised the way that I was
Hmm.
is I would step into other people's family systems of when I'd be dating somebody or I would get in proximity to a friend's parents and their siblings and all that, and would see families that weren't very direct. I remember just thinking like, what is going on here? Because it felt horrible to me.
Yeah.
no one was yelling or shouting at each other or anything like that. Everything was really placid. But the sense of tension that just sort of kept on.
Yeah,
and the
palpable.
sense of- And uh, and so oftentimes I was one that would step in, depending on my role. I would step in, and I would be really quick to be like, "What in the world what? Why is no one saying anything? Why isn't anybody speaking to this directly?" And it's just interesting because even though I don't see myself as a very conflict driven person, I think I was inoculated against the resistance to conflict early.
Yeah.
And because I was trained to see it as being fruitful.
Right.
But kindness is, and going to what we've looked at so far, the core of kindness is doing a moral good towards self or others. You can be kind to oneself, you can be kind to other people, be kind to a community. And this is something that is represented as very core to there in this word, Christotes, that we've been looking at. Here's where it shows up for those who are interested in cross-referencing different verses. But when kind or kindness is shown, it's this word or a variation of this word. It's in Romans 3:12, Psalm 13:3, Psalm 14:3, Romans 2:4, 2 Corinthians 6:6, Colossians 2:12 or 3:12, Colossians 3:12, Titus 3:4, Romans 11:22. But there are two verses I want to just read because they're two very famous verses of where this shows up. It's Galatians 5:22, which is on the fruit of the Spirit. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, this word, Christotes, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. This is a core. If we are called to manifest the fruit of the Spirit, and if we're called to manifest the fruit of the Spirit, it is to look like this deeper moral goodness. And in 1 Corinthians, and you read this one, Matt, then 1 Corinthians 3:14 through, or 1 Corinthians 13:4-5.
That's right. It says, love is patient, love is kind. And that's that word.
Yes.
Love does not envy, is not boastful, is not arrogant, is not rude, is not self-seeking, is not irritable, and does not keep record of wrongs.
And so love in that context too is the Greek word agape, though I heard C.S. Lewis call it agape, and I wonder if that's a more accurate one because he did study Greek.
Right.
But agape, as I always heard it in sermons, but it is this charitable love in the sense of Christian love, a love that is independent of your emotions or your desires. It is the love that God has for us. And it's
so interesting that passage, not to tangent too far on this, but so often that passage is used in a marital context or a wedding as their kind of primary verse that they want to kind of read over the ceremony. And to some credit, I agree with that. I mean, it is love, but this type of love being agape is not or agape, is not the eros, which is the more Greek term for the romantic love that we talk about in couples or marital work. But this being more the Christ likeness or crucifixion love, as it were, applies so much more to how we interact with everybody.
And you have to live in it in marriage, though, and that's in some ways what makes it such an appropriate verse. Is because if you're going to survive in marriage, you've got to lean into agape love. But it comes out of this moment of eros, but eros is so fickle.
Right. Yes. And, as you read it too, there are aspects of kindness has to also play in line with these other attributes that are listed as what is love or what are the fruit of the Spirit. Kindness has to be in concert with patience, with goodness. It has to be in concert with not being arrogant or not rude or self-seeking. It is still for the good of another person. It just may mean that you have to say hard things or do hard things that someone's going to walk away and be like, oh, that was such a great conversation. Like I've had really kind conversations in my past that I think the person walked away feeling awful.
Mhm.
And it's not necessarily because I had done something wrong, although I walk away feeling that way. I have a lot of self-doubt, and I have a really strong internal critic. But God directs me to have some really tough conversations because it's the kindest thing to do for the good of that person.
Mhm. Absolutely.
So
And I
wanted to
do
kind of
not know any intimate relationships, in friendships, in marriage, in close family relationships,
Mhm.
where this sort of kindness does not need to show up.
Yeah.
The kindness that isn't nice.
Mhm.
So we've delved into the word for kindness as it shows up in the Bible, and I was very interested to get into nice. And what I where I geek out in word stuff is etymology is interesting to me, of looking at the source of words. And is that etymology or etiology? It's one of those two.
Yeah. I don't know.
I realized in this, and I in an episode before we were talking about the church at Philippi, and
Yeah.
listening to it, I referred to the Church of the Philippines, which was inaccurate.
I didn't hear that. That's
It
hilarious.
is. It's on our anxiety episode. So if you
Oh,
want to
that's
catch that
funny.
Easter egg, I referenced the Philippines, and my wife was listening to it. She's like, "Could you go in and fix that?" Because
Probably
that's sort of
not.
probably
No.
that sort of
No.
thing drives her nuts. But I've just got to leave it. But it is that for those who did listen to it, I am aware that Paul's letter to the Philippians was the church in Philippi, though churches
Not
in
the
the Philippines do also benefit from reading it the same as we
they
do.
matter just as much.
They matter just as much as us. So, nice does not show up in the Bible. It's not. It wasn't. So it's not a thing. But I was interested in just the word itself, and it was just so fascinating to get into,
Mhm. Mhm.
because there's how I think about it and how Matt and I talked about it, that you could be nice but not necessarily be kind. I've thought about that for a bit, but its root is in Latin. The root word in Latin is nascus. But what that means, what nascus means, is it means ignorant, unaware, not knowing.
Mm.
And how it developed in English uh, is both has negative and positive connotations. That different ways that it's been used is to show words like someone being uh, dissolute or wanton, which is this idea of like they're not really, they're not necessarily living right or living with any discipline.
Yeah.
It also can mean modest and chaste. It can mean something that isn't profane, but it can also mean something that's obscene.
Mm.
So how do those things work together?
Yeah.
And I think another word that isn't exactly accurate in this, but we can think about it, is the sense of innocence.
Yeah.
The same way that a young child who has learned a cuss word, as we say in the South, cussing, has learned a profane word
Yes.
and announces this word at the dinner table with grandparents and aunt and uncles there
With such gusto
with
and
such gusto and
excitement.
all that. Now they are, in that sense, being obscene or profane, depending on what they're saying,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
but it comes from a place of ignorance.
Yeah.
And but it is so it can mean something positive in the sense of like, it's not necessarily willful, but it's also not willful.
Mhm.
In my church tradition, we do a regular corporate confession. And one of the ways that we confess corporately, uh, of the ways that we confess about the ways that we have sinned, for the things that we have done and the things that we have left undone.
Mm.
And it is this idea of what's that's talked about in biblical languages as sins of commission, of doing things, and
Yeah.
sins of omission.
Omission. Right.
And
Yeah.
sometimes niceness
Mm.
can be a willful omission. I'm not necessarily being offensive. I'm not stepping into something, but I'm not letting myself become knowledge to take in knowledge. I'm living in ignorance. I'm
Yeah.
living in this kind of shallow space. And
Right.
it's funny how even different people who speak English will use it differently. So this is a joke.
Mhm.
Matt and I have talked about Southern culture being polite, but I've had several friends that are English. And it's out of relationship with them that I learned this. If you're talking to somebody who's English and you show them a work of art or feed them a meal and ask them what they think of it. If they say, "Oh, that's quite nice," that means it is not good at all. That is, it's not an offense. They're not trying to be offensive. They're not trying to say like, "I hate that," but it is not a compliment.
Right. Yeah.
And it nice in that context is not good.
Yeah.
And so I was just fascinated when I got into this. The like excuse was this it's either this kind of, in the ways that it is positive, it's in this very kind of shallow, unknowing, ignorant positive. And in other times it's negative because it is in this ignorance. It is in this being unaware of.
Well, willful ignorance, and ignorant is such a difficult word because often when people hear it, it's very like abrasive and like offensive. And really it just means not knowing, like
Not
you
knowing,
just you haven't figured it out. But a willful ignorance is, in a sense, I refuse to know. And I think that even in relationships, we do this. It's not just intellect or knowledge, but almost a refuse of wisdom. Don't believe I'm not gonna engage that person, or I'm not gonna say that thing, even though I know it's the right thing to do. It's too difficult, or it would hurt their feelings. And I don't want people to swing the pendulum too far and go the other way. And it's like, well, I just want to. This is back to the whole conflict stuff, but like, I don't want to blow someone up with my. Oh, I'm gonna be kind. I'll say the kind thing. I'll rip into them, and that's not kind either. And so, but that willful ignorance makes me think of, I know the right thing to do. I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, I am sticking my head in the sand.
Yeah.
I'm turning away. And do you, in the sense of moral goodness and integrity, going back to our initial word of Christoses, is, are you desiring the good, the true good? In that sense, where niceness in that sense is very shallow,
Yeah.
kindness in the way that we're getting at is very deep.
Very deep.
And it's not just like on the surface, is this truly good? The same way that your child or your dog may not want to get a bath, but it is a kindness to give that to them. It's a kindness to other people around them, but it's also a kindness to them for them to be clean, to forcing your kid to brush their teeth, to go to the dentist, to get shots, to experience,
to even discipline your child.
Yeah, it is not nice to discipline. That is not a nice thing in the way that niceness means. It can be deeply kind.
Yeah.
And so to your point, Matt, of you don't want to let the pendulum swing so far. And that's so much what our conversations are, is holding these things in tension.
Yes.
That sometimes the kind thing does not come across as nice, but that doesn't mean that because it's not nice, of course it's kind. You can be really direct and speaking, your truth to somebody in a way that's deeply unkind.
That's right.
Because it's not desiring their good.
Yeah.
So I want to wrap up this conversation, Matt, and as this is the church psychology podcast. So for us to talk about this in the context of what this looks like in our work as mental health practitioners, and then to look at this in the sense of the Christian life together. So again, I've already made some references, but I'm known as a therapist, particularly of being a bit direct. That people will seek me out as a therapist because I'm known for that. People will often, when I've had people quit me as their therapist, it's often for that reason. That I'm a little too real, and I've had to grow as a clinician where I don't want to say like, oh, they couldn't take the truth. Like sometimes I have had to really work on blunting some of the sharp shoulders that are coming into things. But
you've also been a clinician for a long time, and so what that probably then does is like you get a little bit freer with your spears.
Sure. And I have enough age and infirmity at this point that I can say things differently to people. But
that a new clinician, like if like any of the new like practitioners out there like listening, they're like, I would never.
That hesitancy is a little good.
It is good. It is.
You got to step into it though. But and what really empowered me in this was actually one of my professors in grad school. He's one of my main professors. He was actually the president of the grad school that I attended. And he said, one of the core things about being a therapist is saying socially inappropriate things to people. And this is the context. He was Southern. I was Southern. The school we were in was in Atlanta. Georgia.
Mhm.
And so in a culture that really elevates niceness like Southern politeness can.
Yeah.
But he said this is really important. You've got to be the person that says things to them that their friends, family, spouses are too hesitant to say because they're afraid of them blowing up. And part of the way I think about it is I don't want my clients to be mad at me, but I have a duty to them to serve them beyond that. And ultimately,
Yeah.
I don't exist in their friendship circle. I'm
Yeah.
an outside person. And
Yeah.
I was actually discussing this with one of my supervisees who I help them in their development and managing their cases, that working with a couple and realizing like, okay, they're really tenuous right now of whether how committed they are in the relationship. And he was presenting
Mhm.
to me
Mhm.
something to maybe challenge them with that came out of a true kindness.
Yeah.
Wasn't going to come across as very nice. And the question was, can they hear it? And
Yeah.
my feedback to him was, maybe, but I think it's worth it right now because this really feels, it's a risky place. And so
Yeah.
taking the risk makes
Yeah.
sense. And
Yeah. Mm.
if you are a therapist, I challenge you to think about this. And if you're in therapy, because I know a lot of therapists that don't do this,
Mm.
that are just overly nice.
Yes.
And if you
And
want to really grow in therapy, you need
that's
to
right.
ask yourself, is my therapist ever kind to me in ways that make me feel uncomfortable?
That's right. Because a lot of times, and I've got this from people, is that they they came from, well, there's kind of two pockets. One is that there are people that go to therapy for the sense of someone just to be kind or nice to them, and that warm presence, and they can just say whatever they want, and they have this kind of sounding board that they go to. What I've seen in that though is that oftentimes that there's not growth that happens in that person's life. Now, there may be incremental things, but over like a 5-year period, there's not been a lot of growth. Uh, Compare that with someone that has been kind to them in therapy, and I've done this before, and often, more often than not, when I have kind but hard things to say, they take it as such a value, like a client would take it as such a value, because in other therapy settings, they haven't necessarily got that. And so some type of push, an old mentor of mine would label it as you need to both entice them and disrupt them.
Mm.
And that was the kindest thing. Like, I do have to build a rapport with them. I need to be warm and show empathy and create a safe environment. And those are all the foundational work of a therapist in the front end. But at some point, I need to start disrupting their patterns because that's the only thing that's going to help them grow. It's for their goodness. And that's not easy conversations. And so I've also seen it to where people really much value that
Mm.
in the therapy setting.
So that's our hot take on that as therapist.
Hot
And
take.
hot take. I want to shift over to you, Matt, to speak to you first, as you work in the pastoral space as well.
Yeah.
Of in the Christian life and formation, how would you think about some key points in thinking through kindness over niceness?
Well, I mean, it's what we've already said to some level, but kindness is the fruit of the spirit and a definition of love, or a
Mm.
part of the definition of love. Um, and so to be a brother or sister in Christ to those in your church community, you cannot do it without being kind, in the kindness that we talk about here. And again, reflecting back on old church mentality, or kind of the cultural church mentality, especially in the Southeast, it's been a lot of niceties.
Mhm.
And I think people, again, it's politeness, it's manners, it's these things. Um, but that's become such a large part of their morality, or like a defining force of it, like a predominant factor that they hold on to over all others, that they don't have deep relationships. They don't find themselves growing. And so these things hinder the process of becoming more like Christ. Because Christ was kind. I mean, he was the kindest of us all, which would say the thing that was for the good of another person, even if it was hard. What's
You
interesting I find about Christ is that we always see him as kind of like forceful against the Pharisees, and he was. I mean, he would say things that were harsh to them. But I have to believe, and I think about this, is that there's a place to which I wonder if that disruption that he would do with them was for the intent for them to see the truth and to follow him. I mean, it wasn't just to blow them up or to cut them off totally. I mean, sometimes he may have to cut them off, but like that type of kindness, like that, I think was still kindness, is maybe the way I want to put it.
If you look at his most intimate relationships with his family and with his disciples
Yeah.
and his immediate followers, most people were rebuked at different
Yeah.
points in ways that
Yeah.
are recorded. Even
Yeah.
Jesus' mother at the wedding of Cana,
Yeah.
she requests that he do
Ooh.
something.
All right,
And he
Jesus.
said, he goes, "Woman, this isn't my time."
Well, and he says woman. It's like if I said that to my mom,
Yeah.
oh.
Yeah. It is,
Well, I think about that too of Peter. So,
Mhm.
Peter's the one that keeps failing. But I think one of the most intimate brothers to Christ in the sense of way they were bonded. But I think about that. I think it's in John where he says, Peter, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. And basically I'm going to let him. And when you return, so basically after you fail, strengthen your brothers. I mean, those are harsh things. It's like, I'm not going to stop this from happening because you need to walk through it.
Mhm.
And so again, that was kind.
Yeah. To wrap up on thoughts of kind of church and church community, I want to do a callback to one of our previous episodes on spiritual bypass.
Mm-hmm.
And which is, I recommend going back and checking it out if you didn't listen to that, but the basic meaning of that idea or that concept is it's a way of using spiritual language to avoid dealing with the realness of something. And I think some of the superficial politeness or niceness that can really permeate a lot of churches looks like that. It becomes this means in which that people skirt around authentic life together.
Yeah.
And part of how I understand church is it is a community of people that are desiring to live under the headship of Jesus and to commit to living life together. And that is, if you do that well, it is messy because you've got a whole bunch of people from the leadership all the way down that are imperfect. Some people, their the effects of sin on their life are much greater than others. And when I say sin in that's not just in the sense of sins of the flesh or the spirit, the culpable sins, but it's also sin in the world. We are all touched by sin by our own actions and by the actions of others. And if you live with people, everyone is touched by that. Everyone is touched by things in themselves that they haven't worked through yet. Yeah. Everyone is touched by things that have happened to them that they may not have worked through yet and come on the other side of yet perfectly. And not everyone is as wounded as everyone else, but everyone's wounded.
Yes.
And you've got a bunch of people doing life together, and oftentimes our wounds will affect the others around us. And I think the mistake that people have in looking at church is they have this idea that if a church is healthy, it is without conflict. If a truly healthy church is one that is always nice. And that there's always agreement. And ultimately, the arc of scripture throughout talks about that to live with your brothers and sisters is to struggle with them. So much of, when a lot in the Old Testament, when a writer would be talking about their sense of persecution, in the Psalms, a lot of the prophets, it wasn't necessarily the persecution or the trials given to them by a non-Israelite. It was within the people of Israel that they were experiencing it. David was being hunted by the anointed king of Israel. This wasn't Moabites or Edomites or Philistines necessarily. In fact, he had refuge at different points with the Philistines in his conflict with Saul.
That's right.
And we will struggle most with the brethren in that sense.
Mm.
And it's something to be grieved. And I think that's when we're in it, I don't think we should necessarily approach it with this kind of flippant, like, well, and that goes into spiritual bypass to say, well, God got us and we'll all be in glory. And no, it can really, really just be horrible, just all sorts of garbage. But to be willing to struggle in that and to choose to love one another in ways that aren't necessarily nice, for me to seek the kindness of those around me, which means I have to think through and commit to what is truly for their benefit and their good. And sometimes it may be hard words.
Yeah, that's really good.
And that is where I think we thrive the most as a body.
That's right. Well, any relationship thrives when it can do that, because we see that within the church, and we see that within relationships of marital relationships or friendships. But anytime conflict is approached in a way of opportunity of depth of connection, it does deepen the connection. When we avoid it, we keep shallow relationships. And so relationships being such a big piece of this, that when we approach it with kindness, the true form of what we're talking about, kindness, I think it will deepen relationships. So, yeah. Well, this is good, David. Thank you for bringing this topic to the table. We hope that you've
talked about, Matt.
Yeah, we hope that you've enjoyed it. And again, as we've referenced these other episodes, please go back and listen to those and give us your thoughts on it too. So we look forward to talking with you again. And until then, we'll say so long.
Thank you again for being a part of our latest episode of Church Psychology. If you have enjoyed it, we hope that you will share this episode with others in your life. And please do remember to follow, like, and or subscribe to Church Psychology wherever you are finding us, and leave us a review. We look forward to connecting with you again soon.